To Admire from Afar. Written by Podfic. Read by Rashi. The air had a slight chill as Hubert wandered into the stables. The sun was just peeking out from the horizon, and there was not a soul to be found. It was far too early for the other students, or even staff members, to be awake at Garreg Mach. On a day with no scheduled lectures, most residents of the academy made it a habit to sleep in late. However, Hubert was unable to keep his eyes shut for prolonged periods of time. Suffering from constant insomnia, he often fell asleep at late hours and awoke at dawn. On most mornings, Hubert would remain locked away in his room until Lady Edelgard awoke and was prepared to start her day. He often spent those few hours hunched over his desk and flipping through various textbooks. He needed all the knowledge he could possess to be useful to his liege. Improving his magic prowess and knowledge as a tactician would be crucial to their future successes. Hence, he took his responsibilities as a student very seriously, even if he knew their attendance at the academy was circumstantial at best. However, Hubert felt tired of being cooped up in his dorm. He had spent the night prior finishing off another tome, so he was eager to move around and escape the stale air trapped within the bedroom. Hence, he found himself idly walking around the campus of Garreg Mach. It was peculiar for the air to be so silent and still, when he was accustomed to the constant sound of muffled conversation and footsteps hastily rushing to their next class. Of course, Hubert found the quiet to be soothing. The occasional tweet of a songbird or scampering of one of the monastery's cats were the only sounds to grace his ears as he casually strolled. Turning the corner, Hubert saw the stables come into view. He was not the biggest fan of this chore when assigned to it by Professor Byleth, but that was usually because he disliked having to be paired with an inept partner. It did not matter whether it was Linhart, who would fall asleep on a pile of hay, Caspar, who would talk loudly the entire time, or even Ferdinand, who he would get into arguments with over every little detail of cleaning out the stalls. Approaching the paddock, Hubert was more interested in visiting here on his own. Unlatching the gate, he walked into the stables and crossed through the center. He saw that most of the horses were also asleep, but he was not interested in them. He continued to walk until reaching a very specific stall. His eyes grew wide as he stared at the sight of a white pegasus before him. He placed his hand on the wooden gates and stared at the gorgeous creature that was bent over to drink water from her trough. He felt like a child visiting a confectionery. The sight of the sterling white mare was truly breathtaking. Her wings were folded against her back, but Hubert could see each individual and intricate feather that overlapped each other from this close proximity. Gripping at the stall, he held his breath when the pegasus lifted her head and turned to look at him. She had noticed his presence, and she slowly turned herself around to greet the young mage. Extending her snout over the gate, her large brown eyes bore into Hubert with innate curiosity. Hello. I hope I have not disturbed you." Hubert spoke quietly, afraid to raise his voice and scare the pegasus. He knew that these creatures were often afraid of men, and did not trust them to get too close. But he had always longed to ride one. It was a silly childhood dream, especially for a man with a fear of heights. Yet he could not help but admire the power and grace held by these animals. A small puff of air was exhaled through her nostrils, as the pegasus observed Hubert with trepidation. Sniffing at his gloved hand, she nudged against his open palm with her nose as a gesture of acceptance. Her tongue glided over the silk glove, and Hubert chuckled faintly at the ticklish sensation through the fabric. He pulled his hand back for a moment, tugging off both of his gloves and shoving them aside to hang out of his trousers pocket. Tenderly, Hubert brought his hand down on the mare's long snout and gave a few scratches with the tips of his fingers. His heart was flooded with glee as he was given the chance to pet such a pretty pegasus. He brought his left hand to her chin to scratch at the smooth fur. It was far from the first time Hubert had touched a horse, but he was amazed by how soft the fur of this particular pegasus felt against his hands. He hummed softly as he brought his fingers towards her mane. He noticed that it was slightly knotted and could use a brushing to tease out the tangles. "Would you permit me to brush you?" he asked, even if he knew he would receive no answer. He turned away from the stall to walk over to a supply closet within the stables. He pulled out a currycomb and brought it back over to the stall with haste. Greeting the pegasus with another short stroke of her mane, he began to neatly run his fingers through her mane and pulled it towards the left side that was facing him. He mumbled a promise about being gentle before bringing the currycomb to her hair. The wooden teeth of the comb glided through her mane, and Hubert stopped whenever he hit a snare. He did not yank or pull aggressively, but he did lift up the strands that were tangled, and carefully combed at the knots until they loosened and fell apart. Smiling to himself, Hubert found the rather repetitive action to be relaxing. He was no stranger to the maintenance of long hair. He had spent much of his time tending to the hair of his liege. Even now, there were times that Lady Edelgard would request his assistance with her braids. As the currycomb was sliding through the mane, he managed to remove every single tangled piece until the horse's hair was entirely smooth. As he began parting the mane, an idea struck him. Hubert had noticed Ingrid's personal pegasus often had her hair braided, so it could not hurt to do the same for this lovely mare. She seemed to enjoy Hubert's personal attention, which the mage did not take for granted. He was accustomed to animals and humans alike being afraid of him, but it felt reassuring that this delicate creature trusted him enough to let him brush through her mane. He started to pull her hair apart into 3 sections, attempting to intricately weave her mane into a loose braid. While Hubert began to twist the mane into a braid, he failed to notice the sound of another person approaching the stables. It was unlike him to let his guard down, but the inner peace he felt from tending to the pegasus was enough to lower his walls for a short time. Along with the quiet humming, he continued to sing to himself as he worked. He did not even hear the sound of the footsteps that were getting closer outside the paddock. Around the corner, another student had found their way to the stables this morning. Freezing in his tracks, Ferdinand von Eyre was standing outside of the stables. He heard the muffled sound of another man coming from the stalls. He was always the first one here on days without classes, minus the few times Marianne had beaten him to the punch. However, the deep humming that Ferdinand could hear did not belong to her. Incredibly curious, Ferdinand tried to keep his steps light, gently pushing the gate to the stables open, and squeezing through without making any loud noises. When Ferdinand turned the corner, his eyes went wide in disbelief. Standing a few stalls down was none other than Hubert von Vestra. He rubbed at his eyes and tried to wipe away any remaining blurry vision that could affect him. However, the sight of the older boy did not change. Hubert was still standing there, beside the gate of the Pegasus stall. Ferdinand was flabbergasted as he watched the mage tending to a white Pegasus with a currycomb in hand. Moreover, Ferdinand was surprised that his hands were exposed from their gloves. It was not like Hubert to remove his gloves. Even during meals at the dining hall, the man would keep them on. In the distance, Ferdinand swore that he could see some strange birthmarks, or something across the tips of the mage's fingers, but he was too far to make out any clear details. Those stained fingers were weaving through the mane, delicately tying it into a large braid across the Pegasus's back. The mare was incredibly calm during the entire process, and she seemed to even enjoy the extra attention that Hubert was providing her. Exhaling a breath he had been unintentionally holding, Ferdinand tried to move in closer. His foot crunched against a clump of straw, and startled Hubert and the Pegasus. "Do not move a muscle, or I shall—" Hubert had dropped the comb, and turned hot on his heels with a blast of miasma burning within his palm. It glowed ominously, ready to be cast upon any foe who dared to sneak up on him. Yet magic quickly faded when Hubert's eyes narrowed, and saw Ferdinand panicking, with his hands sticking out in front of his face. "Please do not attack me! It is only your classmate, Ferdinand von Eyre!" He nearly squeaked out his name in fear of being smacked directly with the miasma. Ferdinand had seen enough of their enemies fall victim to Hubert's insidious magic, and he did not want to feel its wrath. Lowering his hand, Hubert was irritated as he bent down to pick up the comb from the ground. "Why are you sneaking around the stables like a mouse, Eyre?" "It was not intentional, I promise," Ferdinand defended himself, puffing up his chest and pressing a hand to his heart. "It is part of my morning routine to come down to the stables and help assist the stable hands. I do not believe you were assigned this week to this chore." Hubert deadpanned, eyebrow twitching slightly. He turned his eyes upon the Pegasus, hoping he had not lost her trust after using his magic. Ferdinand shook his head, stepping closer, but stopping when Hubert put his hand out to halt him. "Do not make any sudden movements. You may startle her." Hubert saw that the Pegasus was more on edge, pacing around the gate and lifting her hooves. He reached over and placed his hand upon her head, lightly scratching behind her ears. He also brought his left hand to caress her snout, looking into her frightened eyes with a tender expression. His own green eyes were gentle, and he had a faint smile upon his pink lips. "It is all right. He means you no harm, I promise," Hubert whispered to the Pegasus, speaking in a softer tone than usual. Ferdinand did not believe his eyes or ears. He had never saw Hubert behave in such a manner before in his life. At least, he had never seen him show such compassion towards anyone except for Edelgard. Biting his lip, a strange feeling took root inside of him. His stomach began to fill with a swarm of butterflies, and his pulse increased at an alarming pace. His throat felt dry and oddly tighter, and his tongue was tied in a knot behind his teeth. There was something special about the way Hubert stroked the pegasus and finished braiding the end of her mane. Features that Ferdinand once classified as horrifying appeared to be less terrifying and more alluring. Those snake-like green eyes were more attuned to a pair of sparkling gems found in a priceless ring. His messy black hair, like the feathers of a wretched raven, now reminded Ferdinand more of the sleek ink on a quill when writing a personal letter back home. Hubert's sharp cheekbones and jawline that looked as if they could cut a person's finger now appeared to be chiseled by a sculptor, creating a fine piece of art. Even his voice, which often reminded him of grating nails on a chalkboard, was sounding smoother than his favorite cup of tea. Such realizations made Ferdinand sweat and grow flushed when Hubert turned his attention back onto him. He stiffened when the mage walked over, handing him the currycomb. "I will be taking my leave. If you'll excuse me." Hubert started to push past Ferdinand, but the younger man reached for his shoulder. "Wait! You do not have to go!" Ferdinand sputtered frantically, as he was met with a confused gaze. "I am finished here, so I will remove myself from these stables you adore so much," Hubert responded dryly, shrugging off the hand. Ferdinand frowned, but he did not reach again. "You do not have to leave because of me. I do not mind if you stay. In fact, I thought you looked rather cute brushing the pegasus." Hubert audibly gasped and stared bewildered at Ferdinand's choice of words. "Cute? Oh, cool! I meant cool." Ferdinand floundered in an attempt to save himself. His face was hot with a cherry blush at this point, to which Hubert inspected his flustered appearance with apprehension. "Right. Either way, I must be leaving. I need to return to Lady Edelgard before she wakes." Hubert tried to excuse himself again, ignoring the strange thumping in his chest. Disappointed, Ferdinand watched as Hubert opened the gate to the stables and exited. "I hope to see you again soon. I think that Pegasus took a liking to you." Before turning away, Hubert overheard Ferdinand's last comment and bit his lip. "Do not count on it." Without another word, Hubert walked off and left Ferdinand by himself at the stables. As he walked along the path towards the dormitory, he felt his chest start to ache from the sudden increase in his heart rate. Once he was far enough, he pressed his hand to his bosom and cursed under his breath. Why did this have to happen to him? Of all the people to catch him behaving so embarrassingly, it had to be Ferdinand. Touching his cheeks, Hubert felt a massive heat radiating off of them. It was not possible. No. Was he truly so weak-willed to have his heart ensnared by Ferdinand von Eyre? Never. This reaction was from the shame of being caught with the Pegasus, not because of what stupid Ferdinand had said to him by accident. He hadn't meant the word anyway. There was no reason to get all worked up over a small slip-up. Pushing forward, Hubert willed his heart to calm down before he reached his liege's room. He had to forget this morning. There was too much left to do for Lady Edelgard's plans. There was no time for schoolyard crushes. Not that he would ever admit to having one in the first place.